Welcome back, class. Hope you're doing well today. This video is going to introduce some of the ideas from Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women and put it in the context of some of the ideas from modern philosophy that we've been discussing. We'll start out by reviewing this rationalism and empiricism debate, and that'll lead to a traditional story that's often told about the development of modern philosophy, and then that'll lead into discussing a debate between nature versus nurture, which will lead us to Wollstonecraft's goals in this Vindication of the Rights of Women, and then we'll close by talking about Wollstonecraft's overall argumentative strategy. Now, one of the central debates during the modern period was that of between rationalism and empiricism. And that debate, as we've seen, largely concerned the relationships between our reason and our experience and their relationship to our minds and knowledge. Now, rationalism, you shouldn't think of it as just one view. Rather, it's a group of ideas that are often clumped together and associated with this name rationalism. But two of those views that are often associated with this term are the following. There's knowledge rationalism, which says that at least some human knowledge must ultimately be justified directly by the use of our faculty of reason, by using our thought alone, using our understanding to see the truth with just our mind, as opposed to determining the truth using our senses. Another view is called concept nativism. Concepts are the ideas or representations in our mind that allow us to think about things outside of our mind. So I can think about the computer in front of me using the idea of a computer. But I can also think about unicorns using the idea of a unicorn, even though unicorns don't exist. Well, but where do these ideas, where do these representations in our mind come from? According to concept nativism, at least some of these concepts must be innately built into the nature of the human mind. Now, empiricism, on the other hand, is yet again best seen not as just a single view, but a family of views that are often clumped together. Now, two of the views that are often associated with this term, empiricism, are the following. Knowledge empiricism says that all human knowledge, every last bit of it, must ultimately be justified by sense experience. So the claim here is that if you have a belief, if you are not able to trace that belief back to some initial belief that you can justify directly by seeing it, hearing it, feeling it, touching it, tasting it, etc., then your belief doesn't count as knowledge. Concept empiricism is a claim not about our knowledge, but about the source of our ideas. It says that every last one of the concepts, those representations in our mind, is somehow derived from or built from previous sensory impressions that we've had. A traditional story that's often told about the development of modern philosophy goes as follows. It says, we start with Descartes, developing rationalism and using that as a foundation to support this new science as being built by Galileo. And then we get later authors such as Leibniz and Spinoza, who we didn't actually read, but they worked to take that rationalism and apply it even more strictly than Descartes did, to make an even more pure rationalist philosophy. But then, starting with philosophers such as John Locke, who we'll read a bit later, we see philosophical thought slowly turn to a rejection of those rationalist ideas in favor of an empiricist approach. And then towards the end of the modern period, we see Immanuel Kant attempt to reconcile both views and find some bridge between the rationalist and empiricist approaches. We've seen a little bit of that story develop in the narrative that I presented you with early modern thought. Albeit, we've seen it with a few figures that are often less discussed in that narrative. We looked at Descartes' appeal to reason as the proper foundation for knowledge. If we want to gain knowledge or certainty, if we want to remove doubt, we need to use our reason to remove that doubt, because we can't trust our senses because they might fool us, we might be dreaming, etc. We also saw Descartes' acceptance of innate ideas. Even our idea of the physical world itself is innate in our mind, as we see in the wax passage. And the idea of God, we can't get that from our senses. We can't get that from ourselves. It must be put there by God innately in us. And then we saw Jacob and Haywatt further take that rationalist approach and apply it specifically to a reflection on one's own religious traditions and doctrines. And they also used reason as a foundation for moral claims, ethical claims about the equality of all human beings. We saw Cavendish attempt to use reason to question Descartes' mechanical approach to the physical world, and she went even further by taking that reason, that faculty that's so important to rationalism, and trying to spread it out and say it's part of every aspect of the material world itself. Not just human beings, not just the human body, but animal bodies and plant bodies, and all the way down to cells, for instance. And then we saw Amo further developed Descartes' ideas about the essence of the mind, where he thought the mind was purely active thinking. Its nature was purely its active use of that faculty of reason. Even though we've seen that story develop, though, we've seen that it doesn't always fit perfectly. Philosophers' views during this time, they didn't always fit neatly in one category or the other. They often had a mixture of views from both sides. As an example, Anton Willem Amo, who we discussed earlier, yes, he accepted Descartes' conception of the mind as essentially a thinking thing, as the faculty of reason being the defining characteristic of what makes a thing a mind. And he went even further than Descartes in separating the human mind and thought from the realm of sensory experience, because Descartes thought there was still a connection where sensory experience could act upon our minds, could affect, could cause things to happen in our mind. But Amo said no, since the nature of the mind is purely active thinking or reason, the world of sensory experience cannot have any effect, cannot act upon our mind. But despite what seem like rationalist ideas there, he seems to reject Descartes' concept nativism. He rejects that view that any of our ideas are innate in our minds. He says every idea, every mental representation we have of anything is ultimately directed at sensory experience, where those sensory experiences are bodily sensations. Now, this rationalism and Pearson debate may remind you of another debate that's often discussed these days, the debate between nature versus nurture. So to what extent is human thought and behavior determined by our nature, and to what extent is it determined by our environment, by our education, our upbringing, social circumstances? Now, there can be extreme views on both ends. Someone might believe that everything we do and think is determined by our nature. Other people might think that everything we do and think is determined by nurture. But many philosophers held views somewhere between these extremes. That our thinking and behavior is partly determined by our nature and partly by nurture seems pretty plausible. But the difficulty lies in filling in the details. How much of our thinking and behavior comes from nature and how much from nurture? And which aspects of our thinking come from nature and how? And which other aspects come from nurture and how does our environment produce those features? Now, one way to view a vindication of the rights of women is an attempt to distinguish which behavior and traits should be attributed to our nature and which should be attributed to nurture, and it does so for the purpose of specifically arguing that women ought to be given political and social equality during the time that Wollstonecraft is writing. She says, "In what does man's preeminence over the brute creation consist? The answer is as clear as that a half is less than the whole, in reason. What acquirement exalts one being above another? Virtue, we spontaneously reply." So what she's saying here, she adopts this view that what elevates human beings above the level of animals is that part of our nature is that we are able to exercise our reason. And we can use that reason to gain knowledge of the world around us that's not available to animals. We are able to think about mathematics and science and art and history, etc. And we can also use that reason to think about morality. And we can be motivated by moral reasons. So instead of just being motivated by animal instincts like urges for hunger and thirst, we can be motivated by the fact that it's the right thing to do, or that something would be wrong to do to someone else. And we can thereby use our reason to develop our own character and become virtuous beings. So Wollstonecraft isn't merely describing human nature here. She believes that these ideas about what human nature consists in teaches us something about how human beings ought to live, how we should live, and what makes up human well-being or happiness. And so this is a common strategy of argument that goes back until at least Aristotle. Here she says, consequently, the perfection of our nature and capability of happiness, so the ability to be a good person and a happy person, must be estimated by the degree of reason, virtue, and knowledge that distinguishes the individual and direct the laws which bind society. And from the exercise of reason, knowledge, and virtue naturally flow is equally undeniable if mankind be viewed collectively. So let's call this the human nature and the good argument. Her first claim is that human good, human well-being, involves the perfection of our nature. In the same way, what makes something a good car? Well, it's whatever perfects the nature of a car. The nature of a car, the function, the purpose of a car is to help you travel from one point to another. So insofar as something allows or helps that car fulfill that purpose to perfect that nature of transporting us from one location to another, it will make it a good car. Insofar as it makes it difficult for the car to transport us, it will be a bad car. Similarly, whatever our nature is, whatever helps us perfect that nature, will contribute to us being a good, happy person. But that raises the question, well, what is this nature that we need to perfect? Well, human nature is defined by what distinguishes us from other animals, according to Wollstonecraft. She says our faculty of reason and our ability to exercise that reason to gain knowledge and virtue is what makes us different than other animals. And then it would follow that human nature is thereby defined by our ability to exercise reason and gain knowledge and virtue. And so, she concludes, human good, human well-being involves perfecting our ability to reason and the perfection of a virtuous character. So human good is determined by a clear picture of what human nature consists in. However, the main purpose of a vindication of the rights of women is to argue that society has wrongfully used supposed differences between men and women as a way to illegitimately place women in a subordinate position within a social structure. Women share in human nature because they too are capable of exercising reason and developing virtuous character. That's what makes them different from animals. Sharing in that nature means that the good life for women requires the very same rights and opportunities to freely develop their reason and virtue. And so any attempt to appeal to supposed differences between men and women to justify denying human rights to women would be illegitimate because it fails to recognize women's shared humanity. So here, she's trying to argue that many thinkers at the time were being inconsistent. Many thinkers during this time were trying to argue that it was illegitimate for the state or the government to interfere with the lives of men because we have this faculty of reason, and it's best to let people determine for themselves what their happiness consists in and how they're going to approach it, rather than force them into the way of life that you think is best. But what she was pointing out is that many of the thinkers at the time were being inconsistent because they weren't extending that very same reason to women who also shared in that same nature of reason and virtue. She says, I've heard exclamation against masculine women. If men mean to inveigh against their ardor in hunting, shooting, and gaming, I shall most cordially join in the cry. But if it be against the imitation of manly virtues, or more properly speaking, the attainment of those talents and virtues, the exercise of which ennobles the human character, and which raises females in the scale of animal being, when they are comprehensively termed mankind. So mankind is a term to refer to the human species. And she says, insofar as you're talking about masculine virtues in terms of human virtues, all who view them with philosophical eye must, I should think, wish me that they may every day grow more and more masculine. So these, insofar as you're focusing on the virtues that make men distinct from animals, make human beings distinct from animals, well, if those are the masculine virtues, women are also human beings, so you should hope that they develop those same virtues as well. She goes on to say, consider whether, when men contend for their freedom and to be allowed to judge for themselves, respecting their own happiness, it be not inconsistent and unjust to subjugate women, even though you firmly believe that you are acting in the manner best calculated to promote their happiness. Who made man the exclusive judge, if women partake with him the gift of reason? So this is that inconsistency claim that I talked about. If one argues that men ought to be allowed to make their own choices, that's the best thing so as to allow them to exercise their own reason. then if women also have reason, they too ought to be allowed to exercise that freely and determine for themselves the best way to live for them. However, Wollstonecraft's argument goes even further than this. She argues that any mental differences between the sexes are themselves the result of the different treatment that women have been given in society, rather than a result of any fundamental natural difference between the sexes. So if the differences in the behavior and thinking of men and women are themselves the result of the way that society treats women, then those differences can't be used to justify, to legitimize that treatment. She says, men complain, and with reason, of the follies and caprices of our sex, when they do not keenly satirize our headstrong passions and groveling vices. Behold, I should answer, the natural effect of ignorance. So she's saying, yes, there might be important criticisms of the behavior and character of women, but the character that you're criticizing is itself a result of the way that you're treating them. And so you can't justify treating them that way by appealing to that character or that behavior. Women are told from their infancy and taught by the example of their mothers that a little knowledge of human weakness, justly termed cunning, softness in temper, outward obedience, and a scrupulous attention to a puerile kind of propriety will obtain for them the protection of man. And should they be beautiful, everything else is needless for at least 20 years of their lives. So the idea is they're taught from a young age that what they should be aiming for is marriage and to secure the protection of a man, and that this is the way to do it, to act in these ways, have this kind of character. They're conditioned from the very time they are born to value these kind of things and behave in these kinds of ways with these kind of goals. And the idea is, if that's what you teach them from the moment that they're born, of course they're going to act in those ways. Of course they're going to do exactly what you taught them to do. So it's not that their nature is different, it's that you taught them to act in that way. The solution is to not treat them that way. So we can call this the environmental differences argument. The first premise is that if observed mental differences between man and woman are themselves caused by society treating them differently, then those mental differences cannot justify society's treating them differently. And then she claims that any observed mental differences between the sexes are in fact caused by the way society treats them. It's a product of nurture rather than a product of differences in their nature. Therefore, any observed differences between man and woman cannot justify this differential treatment. Finally, Wollstonecraft attempts to argue for at least two additional ideas in defense of her conclusion that women during her time ought to be granted equal social and political rights. Especially, her focus is really on education. She thinks a proper education in science, math, religion, morality is what's going to allow women to develop their character and virtue so as to allow them to develop their own happiness and also contribute to society as a productive member as well. She says granting women these political freedoms and rights will benefit women's own well-being, but also granting women these political freedoms and rights will benefit society more generally. She says the more understanding women acquire, the more they will be attached to their duty comprehending it. For unless their morals be fixed on the same immutable principles as those of man, no authority can make them discharge it in a virtuous manner. They may be convenient slaves, but slavery will have its constant effect, degrading the master and the abject dependent. The idea here is if you don't give a proper education to women and you just force them to behave in certain roles, but they don't understand why, they're not likely to stick to that role. They'll likely resent the master that's forcing this upon them. Whereas if you give them an education so that they can use their own reason to discover what's the best ways that they can contribute to society, they will more likely be attached to their duty and not feel that kind of resentment when they choose it for themselves using their own reason. She also says, it's vain to expect virtue from women till they are, in some degree, independent of men. Nay, it's vain to expect that strength of natural affection which would make them good wives and good mothers. Whilst they are absolutely dependent on their husbands, they will be cunning, mean, and selfish. How can we expect them to discharge those ennobling duties which equally require exertion and self-denial? So the idea is if we teach them to depend on men for their livelihoods, then they're going to do whatever they can in order to secure that safety. And if that's the way that you raise them, how can you expect them to behave in ways, in morally valuable ways, that would require them to act in ways that they haven't been conditioned to do so? She goes on to say, well, these are the kind of things that women ought to be allowed to do. Women might certainly study the art of healing and be physicians as well as nurses. They might also study politics, business of various kinds. They might likewise pursue, if they were educated in a more orderly manner, which might save many from common and legal prostitution. Woman would not then marry for a support. So the claim here is, by giving them this right, this freedom to take on these professions, they won't thereby be forced to engage in other kinds of professions that other people might see as less moral for the purpose of just sustaining their lives. And that will be good for society. Lastly, she says, meanwhile, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty. And this desire, making mere animals of them, when they marry, they act as such children may be expected to act. They dress, they paint, they nickname God's creatures. Can they govern a family or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world? So her claim here is that if you teach them that the most important thing is to be beautiful so as to attract a man, to catch his fancy, if you teach them to do that, they won't learn what they need to learn in order to actually contribute to society or play the roles that people think that they're supposed to play. Now notice, there's a part of this that seems progressive for the time in advocating for women's rights, but she also seems to have some outdated views about what reason should lead you to think that the role of women would be, even if they freely choose it. So that's something to think about, is which aspects of her thought are progressive enough to still be relevant today, and which seem to be outdated and maybe products of the time in which she was writing. So that's all for this video. See you all next time. Bye-bye.